The Battle of Yorktown was the final war in the Revolutionary War, and so it started when British General Cornwallis set their base in Yorktown as a place to get some supplies there. The only problem with this is that a French general, Lafayette, had set up spies which quickly told him, and Lafayette told George Washington. George Washington had also heard about another French admiral coming to Chesapeake Bay. This admiral was also bringing a lot of weaponry, and so, because of this, Americans started secretly heading down to Chesapeake Bay. Soon, Americans had set up their relationships with the French, and so the French started heading down over to Chesapeake Bay, bringing their own weaponry to help fight with the Americans. The date is now September 5th, 1781. The two fleets of the British and the French attack over water. The two sides remained close to each other on the sides of the Cape for a couple of days until the British retreated back to Yorktown and got repaired while the Americans continued their blockade at the York River. It's around this time that George Washington received a letter from Lafayette, a French general I talked about before, talking about their success in Chesapeake Bay and what their next move will be. Some important parts from the letter is when it says, "By a deserter from York, I hear that 2 British frigates followed the French fleet and returned after they had seen them from out of the Capes. A spy says that 2 schooners supposed to be French have been seen coming from the York River." This is important because it shows how the Americans had even more support from the French coming. That was an advantage given to the British as they could know in advance where the French were coming from. Another part from the letter is when it says, "Lord Cornwallis one time rendered himself very respectable." This showed how the Americans were confident in themselves that they had a high chance of winning the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. Lastly, the final important part from the letter is when it said, "My conduct emboldens me to request that as General Lincoln will of course take command of the American part of your army." This is important because General Lincoln was a major general during the Revolutionary War, and General Lincoln was an important general for the Americans. Continuing the story, a few days after the blockade at the York River, Cornwallis is informed about a British general coming to help them, bringing supplies and reinforcements, and then 3 days after that, Lafayette and Washington finally meet up with each other, because they had been separated earlier, with one of their only forms of communication being letters, hence the one that I've talked about before. And according to the people who were there, they hadn't seen any 2 people greet each other with more joy than Lafayette and George Washington had. 4 days after those 2 meet, de Grasse, another French general, meets up with George Washington as well, and they all, known as the American Francos, meet on de Grasse's ship, named the Ville de Paris. The American Francos now arrive at Williamsburg on September 20th, 1781, and so they prepare. The British's attack ships now release, attacking the French's blockade at the York River, although not succeeding and leaving the British returning again to Yorktown. A little bit later, the American Francos start their progress up into Yorktown and try to investigate what the British are up to. During September 30th, 1781, the American Francos built barriers near Yorktown. The British had made an attempt to use their artillery to mess up the barriers. The British are now around Gloucester, a city near Yorktown. And so, the Americans make their way north into Gloucester and defeat the general that was leading those British, that general being named Tarleton. It's at this point where the American Francos have trapped the British in Yorktown, as Gloucester was one of their only ways out, and so the American Francos made the first siege line, where they dug out areas in one night because of the rain. This was so that they could stay safe while their artillery would fire at the British. Later on October 16, 1781, George Washington sends a letter to Thomas McKean, the President of the Continental Congress, with a few notable moments from it like, "The works which we have carried are of vast importance to us. From them we shall enfilade the enemy's whole line, and I am in hopes we shall be able to command the communication from York to Gloucester." This talks about the Americans' plan and how they will play out the war in 3 days, and this plan eventually led to the Americans winning. Another important part from the letter is, "The enemy last night made a sortie for the first time." Then later on in the letter, "They were repulsed the moment the supporting troops came up, leaving behind them 7 or 8 dead and 6 prisoners. The French had 4 officers and 12 privates killed and wounded, and we had 1 sergeant mortally wounded." This talks about the British troops that tried attacking during the night a little bit before the Battle of Yorktown, the French capturing the British troops, and the French had defeated the troops that had come out. And lastly, from the letter is, "Nothing could exceed the firmness and bravery." This shows how George Washington had thought the troops that the American Francos had were good. Now on the dates between October 16th and October 17th, 1781, artillery is fired from the American Francos, destroying Cornwallis's fortifications. At this moment, Cornwallis realizes that backup won't arrive in time, and so at midnight he decides to sneak away from Yorktown at the waterfront. Cornwallis isn't able to because of the storm, and he doesn't have the right equipment, barely any food, and his troops are getting sick. And so, because of this, Cornwallis decides to finally surrender to the Americans. The Battle of Yorktown affected the Americans positively as they had earned their own independence from winning the war. The Battle of Yorktown had affected the British negatively, though, because they had to surrender, using a lot of money throughout the battle, only to lose to the Americans and the French. The Battle of Yorktown had affected the Revolutionary War as it was the final battle in which the Americans had won, giving them independence. Although if we lost, that would mean that we would have to be under British control, being a part of Britain instead. But that didn't happen. The Americans had earned their freedom and got their own country and independence away from the British with the Treaty of Paris.